All right, we are running and you are streaming live.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome everyone to the meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board, and I hope you're all doing well and staying healthy. To remind everyone, we're meeting by via Zoom because of COVID, and if you have written public comments, you can email them directly to the email address shown here, visb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. We'll also take oral comments. You'll need to identify what specific agenda item you would like to provide an oral comment on. And when we call on you, then you can please state your name and affiliation before you do your public comment. I'd start to move on to the roll call, and you can take that thing down. And we'll just do a roll call and give your full name and whether or not you've had any new declarations since our last board meeting. Steve Brandt, no new declarations. Jay?
Jay Lund, no new declarations.
Jim?
Jim Cloran, no new declarations.
Okay, is Virginia here? Virginia?
Yes, I'm here. I have no declarations. Thank you.
Okay, Tanya?
Tanya Heikela, no new declarations.
Tom?
Tom Holzer, no new declarations.
Diane?
Diane McKnight, no new declarations.
Bob?
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
Lisa?
Lisa Wanger, no new declarations.
Okay, and Joe has given his apologies for the first half an hour or so of this. He is has one of his students defending today at this time, and he'll try and get here by noon our time. Move on to number 2, which is the chair's report. And as a reminder, I think all of you are aware that we are under curtailment and minimization of our activities given the uncertainty or given the issue of we're not getting any compensation at the moment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the final item when we talk about where to go from here and what the status is of that compensation issue. We'll take that up later. One item I want to report that Mike Chakowski and I presented the science needs assessment progress to DPIC on October 26th. And we told them, updated them on the actual workshop, which was October 5th and 6th, and some of the preliminary results that came from that and where we intend to go with this report. The steering committee did meet yesterday and talked about and looked at I'd say a rather detailed outline of what that report's going to look like. And I think we're getting pretty good consensus on the main topics and the main priorities we want to put forward to DPIC. We'll be talking about this in detail in our December meeting, at least as of right now, it's on that agenda. I've asked Laura Larson if she had anything to announce during my report, and she has 2 items she'd like to briefly announce.
Yes, thanks. It's nice to see all of you, and I hope your day is off to a good start. The first thing I wanted to mention is that the official version of the Delta Science Program proposal solicitation package was just released on Monday. Hopefully you have all received my email providing you with a link to that proposal solicitation, but I would appreciate it if you could share it with your networks as widely as possible. We are anticipating issuing up to $9 million of funding with this proposal solicitation, with up to $3.5 million of that coming from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. The requirements for the proposals are that each proposal must contribute towards one or more action areas identified in the science action agenda and or priority management needs. And there's a really nice table within the proposal solicitation package that provides some good examples and highlights concrete management needs and priority action areas that are relevant to the solicitation. The proposals that we're soliciting are in 2 different categories. There's a standard research award category for focused proposals that may be disciplinary. The maximum anticipated award is $700,000 per proposal, but we're also recruiting proposals that are much smaller in budget than that. These are for 12 to 31 month proposals. And then the second category of awards is new this year with this solicitation package, and it's Integrated Socio-Ecological Systems Awards. These are larger in scope. They're inherently interdisciplinary and must involve a substantive integration of a biophysical science discipline with a social science discipline. So we're really excited about this solicitation. We're hoping for a really good crop of proposals and a diverse crop of proposals this year. A couple of deadlines to keep on your calendar are December 15th, when we're submitting, or we're requiring proposers to submit letters of intent. These are non-competitive letters of intent that are designed to help us put together adequate panels for review. Applications themselves will be due February 12th. And then a few other dates that are important are December 2nd and January 8th, which are the dates of two pre-due date webinars that are informational. That's a chance for potential PIs to ask any questions that they have about this solicitation. So the second item that I wanted to announce is the 2021 Bay Delta Science Conference, which is our biennial forum for presenting both technical analyses and results relevant to the Delta Science Program's mission, and also uniting scientists and managers. Next year, it will take place between April 6th and April 9th. It will be offered jointly with the Interagency Ecological Program Workshop, which will take the form of a dedicated track within the Bay Delta Science Conference. The conference theme this year is building resilience through diversity in science. So as the Bay Delta science community works towards a goal of one Delta, one science by building resilience in our ecosystem, our institutions, and our collective science enterprise, promoting diversity in its many facets plays a central role, which is recognized by this year's theme. Charting pathways to get to a more diverse scientific community is essential in order to build resilience within our science as well. So we're inviting talks and sessions that provide insight into the diversity of the natural system, including species, genetic, habitat diversity, et cetera, that represent a diversity of perspectives and that explore ways to recruit a more diverse scientific community. This is particularly relevant right now because the abstract deadline is in 10 more days on November 23rd. And this is also the deadline for submitting session proposals. So these would be proposals for oral or poster topical sessions. And you could find the link to abstract submission on the Delta Stewardship Council's website, or if you're just doing a Google search, I know that Maven's Notebook also published the call for abstracts. I don't want to cut into your meeting too much, but I'm happy to answer any quick questions now.
Thanks, Laurel. In the past, of course, we have always, almost always given presentations at both IEP and the Bay Delta Conference, but I don't see us moving in that direction this year, given where we are in our activities. Our agenda, we just have two items on our agenda today. One is the, as we said, we would have a 1 hour or 50-minute session where we would be exploring new topics and do some brainstorming. So we have one session on that today, led by Jim on food webs. And the second item will be an update, or we'll be looking specifically at the invasive species review and see where we are in that. So if there are any public comments on this particular item, Edmund?
There are none.
Okay, we'll move on to item 3, and that is the food web and sustainability. And I thank Jim for taking the lead on this. And Jim, turn the podium over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Steve. Later in this ISB meeting, we're going to discuss this report on non-native species in the Delta. And that report makes a number of recommendations. And I think the first recommendation in that report is to build spatially explicit models of Delta food webs. And so with that in mind, I thought that might be a topic that we could use to begin this process of learning about the Delta, what the issues are, and considering topics that we might want to explore in more depth maybe next year. So I'm going to give a short presentation. We're going to move up the food web, and I'm going to give a short presentation about what we know and don't know about primary production. So I want to talk about production at the base of the food web. And then I invited Wim Kimmerer, professor at San Francisco State University, who's been working on primary consumers, and in particular zooplankton, and especially copepods in the Delta and in the Bay. So Wim's going to talk a bit about that. And then I asked Ted Sommer, a biologist from the California Department of Water Resources, to talk about things we know and things that we don't know about higher trophic levels, and in particular fish. So if we could have the first slide, please. I thought it would be a good idea to start with a map of the Delta. And there we go. Can we go back one more slide? Okay. So I just want to kind of give an introduction to the Delta as a landscape. This is a remarkable map that was put together by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and the colors show the distributions of 5 different wetland habitat types in the historical Delta, and we're talking 200 years ago. So this is what the Delta landscape looked like 200 years ago. You can see a lot of green, and the green represents tidal marsh and non-tidal marsh. So the Delta was a marsh-based system. And I think it's important to recognize that this is an inland river delta ecosystem. And so it's formed at the confluence of California's 2 largest rivers, the Sacramento that comes from the north, the San Joaquin that comes from the south. And in terms of scale, the area of this wetland complex in its natural undisturbed state was 2,300 square kilometers. And that's the size of Chesapeake Bay. So historically, this was a big wetland complex composed of 5 different wetland habitat types that were connected by tidal flows and river flows. Okay, next slide, please. This is what the Delta looks like today. A map also produced by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And you can see that the green is basically gone. So the tidal marshes and non-tidal marshes have been lost. They've been levied and converted into agricultural lands. The dark blue is open water habitat. That's actually expanded relative to the historical Delta. And on the top here, you see this kind of orange color, and that represents a habitat type that didn't exist in the historical Delta. It includes managed floodplains. So the Delta has been an extremely transformed ecosystem. And when I first saw these maps as an ecologist, I wondered, well, what does this landscape transformation mean in terms of ecosystem processes like primary production? So we put together a team of people that includes Nyman, and we have a first order answer to the question of what this landscape transformation means in terms of primary production. So we're talking now about production at the base of the food web. So the next slide, please. So in the upper left here, you see the 5 different primary producer groups we considered: phytoplankton, attached microalgae, marsh plants, aquatic plants, and woody riparian plants. That was Bob's part. And the approach that we used was really simple. For each of these plant communities, we identified, based on scouring the literature, we identified characteristic aerial rates of primary productivity, and then we just simply multiplied them by the aerial extent of the habitats where these producers inhabited, comparing the historical and the modern Delta. So the outcome from this approach is that total annual net primary production of the historical landscape was on the order of 1,300 kilotons of carbon per year. And if we do that same calculation for the modern landscape after the marshes have basically been removed from the system, it's less than 100 kilotons of carbon per year. So we've known for a long time that one of the consequences of this transformation was lost primary production, but now we have numbers. The second thing that we did was to make an assessment of where that organic carbon went in terms of consumers. And we considered 2 pathways: direct herbivory and production of detritus. So the next slide, please. We have quantitative estimates of the mass of carbon that was consumed by herbivores in historical landscape compared to the modern landscape, and the same thing with detritus production. And you see that, you know, this was a marsh system. The detrital pathway was an important part of moving organic carbon from producers to consumers. And still, the detrital pathway is important in terms of carbon flow, even though the marshes have largely disappeared. So next slide, please. So what do we know about primary production in the Delta? We know something about the magnitude of net primary production in 5 habitat types. We know something about at least the magnitude of carbon flows to herbivores and detritus production. We know that the Delta has been transformed from a marsh-based wetland system to one that's aquatic-based. So most of the primary production now is in open water habitats by vascular plants and phytoplankton, whereas those were minor contributors to total ecosystem production historically. Next slide, please. And then we've also learned about the importance of managed floodplains, and especially during wet years. And Ted Sommer is going to say something about this. Okay, so the last slide that I want to show, next slide please, is what are the things that we don't know? And of course, this is a really long list. And I just highlighted 4 things that we don't know. And if we were going to go about constructing quantitative food web models for the Delta, we'd have to know the answers to these questions. So first of all, we know very little about the structure of food webs. So we can say something that on the order of 20 kilotons of carbon per year are going to herbivores, but we don't know who those herbivores are in terms of their relative importance as secondary producers. So we don't know the trophic linkages from the plant producers to amphipods and copepods and bivalves and other mollusks and mysids and even fish. So we know very little about the trophic linkages between the primary producers and the consumers. This calculation that we did is a static calculation. It doesn't consider any kind of transport. So we know very little about transport of organic carbon, both within the Delta ecosystem and downstream from the Delta ecosystem to the bay, and the quantity that's exported to the coastal ocean. We know this is only a consideration of net production in the Delta itself, the legal Delta. So we don't know anything about net production upstream of the Delta or downstream of the Delta. And finally, the elephant in the room question is, what are the implications for this loss of primary production for California's goal of protecting and restoring the health of the Delta? So this is what I wanted to share with you to kind of begin the discussion, some things that we do know and don't know about primary production. So if we could have the next slide, please, I'd like to pass this off to Wim to share some insights into what we know about secondary production in the Delta. So next slide.
All right, thanks, Jim. So I'm taking a somewhat different perspective here. I'm focusing really on the brackish to fresh habitats for pelagic organisms in the estuary. And so I don't really have a geographic frame of reference because I work on plankton and they live in a moving frame of reference. But that said, I should point out a couple things. One is that most of what I'm presenting is based on long-term monitoring data from IEP and also from work that I've done with collaborators. This graph depicts what I call the hole in the food web, or why the hole is there. And by the hole in the food web, I mean that there's a big dip in the phytoplankton biomass in the low salinity zone and roughly Suisun Bay. And this graph shows the calculated net growth rate of phytoplankton. This is from a paper, I meant to put that down here, but it's a paper by me and Jan Thompson of the USGS. in which we looked at grazing by clams, copepods, and microzooplankton. And we calculated the net growth rates of phytoplankton by month and presented here in this box plot. And basically, during the spring, there's a chance of phytoplankton escaping predation and being able to have a positive growth rate. And we do see still occasional spikes in productivity or spikes in chlorophyll concentration in the springtime. But during the late spring into summer, and especially late summer, there's just no way for phytoplankton in the northern estuary to get a hold of anything. So you just don't see high productivity or high biomass during that period. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is pretty busy. This is to demonstrate the consequences, and it has to do with the phytoplankton as biomass as estimated by chlorophyll concentration in the upper left, and then the abundance of 5 copepod species. And I focus on copepods partly because those are the critters that support the pelagic food web. So the Delta smelt, longfin smelt, and other pelagic fishes and other organisms really rely on the copepods as their main food source. So in the upper left, I was going to animate this, but for reasons of somebody else running it, I thought I would just show you the whole thing. So if you can focus on the upper left-hand corner, the chlorophyll graph has 3 panels. Left-hand panel is 1972 to 86, middle one is 87 to 93, right-hand panel is 94 to 2019, and these are broken up into 3 periods because the left-hand period is pre-Potamocorbula clam, the middle one is before the invasions of several new copepods, and the right-hand one is after that invasion. And the x-axis on all these is month, and the y-axis is salinity. So this is IEP monitoring data. And so the upper panel with chlorophyll, you can see a very strong chlorophyll maximum at around a salinity of 5, which in the summertime is typically up in the delta, in the western delta, but in the spring is usually down in Suisun Bay. And you can see that was persistent in pretty much every year, and from essentially March until November. And then in 1987, this is a story that Andrea Alpine and Jim Cloran first showed. In 1987, there was a big decline, and that was coincident with the arrival of Potamocorbula. And there's since been done, since people have done lots of work on that, and it's all consistent with a cause and effect. So essentially, we haven't had any chlorophyll since to speak of. So the second graph, the second one down on the left, is the copepod Eurytemera caroleae, formerly known as Eurytemera affinis. And the pattern for Eurytemera is kind of similar to that for chlorophyll. It was very abundant at a salinity, in the low salinity zone, essentially, at a salinity of about 2 to 5 or so, 1 to 5, until 1987, when it declined precipitously. And since then has been abundant in the winter and in the late spring and fall, and essentially absent from the estuary the rest of the time. It's not really absent, but it's abundant in very low numbers. And that's gone on ever since that 1987 event. The next one down, Synocalon Astoria, is more of a freshwater species, and it followed a similar pattern, except that it does sort of maintain a freshwater population that sort of dwindled after 1993. Upper right-hand corner is Pseudodapnus forbizae, which was introduced in 1989. It was, so it's obviously not present before 1989, and so it doesn't occur in that first panel. In the second panel, you can see it was quite abundant in low salinity regions. And then after 1993, its abundance shrank and pulled back to the point where it's really now abundant in fresh water, and individuals of that species leak into saltwater, into brackish water. The next two kind of go together. Cartiela Sinensis arrived in 1993, and it's abundant, quite abundant in salinities of say 2 to 8 or so in the late summer and into the fall. And well, that perplexed us for a while, but if you look at the next graph, Limnoithona tetraspina, you see that it's ridiculously abundant during the summer and in pretty much all salinity ranges from about 1 to about 10. And so that seemed rather perplexing when we started pulling at this. So over the last decade or decade and a half, my lab has been pulling at the strings of this pattern and trying to figure it out. And I think we have it figured out. So going back to the beginning, we have this loss of chlorophyll, which is the base of the food web. Eurythemera is no longer present in the system in the summertime. So it essentially has a temporal refuge from clam predation. And I should also mention that in addition to removing the phytoplankton, the clams also remove the larval stages of these copepods to a great extent. So I'm going to skip over Synocalon. This upper right-hand corner, Pseudodapnus forbizae has a spatial refuge. It's most abundant in freshwater, and its larvae and its young sort of leak into the low salinity zone by dispersion. But in 1994, that was greatly reduced. And the reason is the next one down, Cartiela Sinensis, which is a predatory copepod, and it chows down on the Nauplius larvae of these other copepods. So that curtailed some of that flux of copepods into the low salinity zone. And so as a result, there's a whole lot less available for fish to feed on since 1993. Now, how is it that a Cartiela is able to survive? Well, it's a predator. It feeds mainly on the Nauplius larvae of copepods. And the next one down, Limnoithona, is its food supply. So Limnoithona is very abundant. It's very small, not much fed upon by fish. And why? So why is it present? And so we've actually done some work on mortality of these guys. And it turns out that Pseudodapnus has a ridiculously high mortality rate of its larval stages in the low salinity zone, in salinity above about 1. While Limnoithona also has a high mortality rate to its larval stages, but its adults and its juveniles are essentially invulnerable to predation. They're hardly preyed upon by fish. Their mortality rates are very low. And so basically they have a life stage refuge from predation, and a Cartiela Sinensis has a food supply refuge. Pseudodactylus has a spatial refuge, and Eurythemera has a temporal refuge. So these are the reasons why we have anything at all in the low salinity zone, which without these refuges, we wouldn't have anything to supply food for fishes. So next slide, please. So what do we need to know? What are the big unknowns right now? We actually don't quite understand what supports high zooplankton production. We thought we did until we started actually looking at the foods that the zooplankton eat and what supports high growth rate. It turns out that we have lots of data now on observations of growth rates and phytoplankton biomass. And yes, they do grow faster when phytoplankton biomass is high, but it hardly ever is. So in most of the estuary. So, and we also know that they feed on cyanobacteria, which are supposed to be junk food for copepods, and microzooplankton, which is pretty well known. But we don't really have a good handle on which foods actually promote high zooplankton production. And then finally, we've been doing some work on longfin smelt with some of our colleagues in various agencies and other organizations. And we've been looking, my lab has been looking at their food resource. The problem is that the geographic limits of sampling. Essentially, longfin smelt live throughout the estuary and mainly in brackish water. But they spend a lot of time down in the lower bays where the zooplankton monitoring doesn't go. So, so from an ecosystem perspective, which we're all waving the flag for, we're not actually doing a very good job of monitoring these guys and their food supply where they actually live. And even the longfin smelt larval survey, which is intended to look at their specifically this fish, misses a lot of the larvae during high flow periods. And that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer questions, I guess, after Ted.
Hi, everyone. Edmund, go ahead and go to the next slide. So for better or worse, the endpoint of a lot of our management activities in the estuary are fish. I'm here to give a lightning review of some of the historical work, to give you an example case study where we've really learned a lot about feeding ecology, and then, like Wim, talk about some of the future needs. So our work on fish feeding ecology probably began around the 60s or so, before the water projects came online. There were a number of traditional diet studies looking at the guts of these different fish. So we know a moderate amount historically about what species like striped bass and salmon ate. And then increasingly over the years, a lot of the emphasis shifted to delta smelt. So we have a moderate amount of information on just traditional diets. The other tool that we've used increasingly is the use of experimental enclosures, kind of a classic ecology tool, placing enclosures in different habitats and looking at the food web responses. And I'll talk about one of the examples in a second of where we learned a lot. We've also applied a lot of this information to bioenergetic modeling to understand when there's a food web change, such as the one Wim described, what's the response? So Delta smelt and Chinook salmon are both examples where we've used a modeling approach to integrate that data. The other approach that's been informative is using isotopic studies. So one of the better examples is looking at how the isotope signatures for fish feeding change when they're near submerged aquatic vegetation. So this is the large beds of invasive vegetation change versus the open water pelagic habitat that Wim was just discussing. And then more recently, some of the USGS and UC Davis folks have done quite a bit of work looking at marsh habitats and how the isotopic signatures compare to other regions of the estuary. Also, one of the more modern tools, use of DNA and eDNA, so metabarcoding is one of the cool new tools people have started to apply to get a better sense of feeding ecology. Next slide, Edmund. So one of the areas that we've really learned a lot and enough to make actual management changes is Yola bypass. So as you heard from Jim, this is the primary floodplain of the San Francisco estuary. It's the former flood basin of the upper Sacramento River. It was partially levied to try and maintain it as a flood basin. And in the process, they've created a seasonal floodplain habitat that we found to be remarkably productive. So I don't know that I have an image that accurately reflects it, but this is a really unique system to study because it kind of acts in parallel to the adjacent Sacramento River. So we have an opportunity here to look at food web responses and other environmental responses in this seasonal habitat in parallel to sampling that we've been doing in the adjacent Sacramento. So we've had a couple decades of using different approaches to look at this off-channel habitat. This has allowed us to do comparative studies looking at diets, bioenergetics, cage studies, And one of the most obvious responses that I hope many of you are aware, we found that these off-channel habitats are much more productive. In fact, this is really one of the major rearing habitats for some of the key native species, like downstream migrating juvenile shark salmon. So insect production is very high out here in flood events, but that isn't the only food source. We've also learned that zooplankton, as Wim was describing, can also be a major food source. So during lower flow conditions, the floodplain is connected to the estuary at its base through tidal flows, and we can accumulate fairly high levels of productivity there. And as part of that, we've also found that when we do get even modest flow pulses through that system, we can get subsidies to the downstream estuary. So this has led to some pretty major management changes to try and improve the functioning of the system. So one of the problems with the system is that during drier periods, we don't get that inflow from the Sacramento River. So connectivity is poor, and we don't get fish access to the habitats, at least from the Sacramento at the top. We also don't get the downstream subsidies. So we're working on a large project to build a notch at the top of the floodplain to provide better connectivity to the Sacramento River. That'll give us hopefully a lot more of a food web response and increase rearing habitat. The other example of food web applications is we've also learned that it's not all about the high flow periods. The tidal portion of this region is very productive, and we're doing active large-scale experiments during summertime with managed flow pulses to try and move food web information down there. So again, here's an example where we've studied in a habitat intensively, looked really in detail at the food web, and managed to provide some lessons that could be used for management. Next slide. So what's our wish list? Well, we mentioned a lot of the progress in pelagic habitats, but there are other sorts of food sources out there. So benthic food sources, we've seen a lot of the fish are eating amphipods. So epibenthic fauna we don't sample well, and we don't have a good handle of their contribution to the food web. Other off-channel areas, tidal wetlands, submerged aquatic vegetation. Jim mentioned that historically those were really major inputs to the system, and so we need a better handle on how these areas contribute now. Greater use of experimental approaches. I mentioned the use of enclosure studies to kind of do direct comparisons and manipulations. We need to do more active manipulation so that we can learn using more of a classic ecological strategy. One of the final things I'll note, we could really use more integration of this information into fish life cycle models. And finally, we need to better understand the potential management actions that we can use to improve fish response. Those include obviously habitat restoration, but also some of the flow actions I mentioned, and whether or not there's ways that we could do management of invasive species, for example, aquatic plants. So that's a 5-minute whirlwind introduction to fish feeding ecology in the system. Jim, I don't know how you wanted to proceed now with the discussion, but that's it for me.
Well, I think this is what we wanted to accomplish, is just kind of touch the very surface of this complex topic. And I suspect that members of the ISB have questions for the three of us. And so do we have a chat room here, or can we raise our hands? How do we do this? Maybe just raise your hand if you've got a question. Jay, yeah.
Thank you very much. This was really great. I really enjoyed, Jim, especially your presentation on the productivity. There's an awful lot of agriculture that goes on in this area. does any of that and the drainage channels, I'm thinking each of these islands has a tremendous network of drainage channels. And maybe there's some detrital material that comes off the agricultural landscape that gets drained and pumped into the delta. Does any of that have any significance? There's so little natural ecosystem input. I'm wondering if that's an important aspect to consider.
I'm gonna give a partial answer to that question. I showed you in that really bulk scale calculation that detritus is the largest source of organic carbon to consumers.
Right.
But that calculation did not include any sources of detritus that originated with agricultural production. And but I do know that that these managed floodplains where rice is grown are important in terms of fish production. So I wonder if Ted or Wim could say something about that. And the experimental approach in flooding rice fields for enhancing fish production.
Yeah, so we've looked at the direct managed flooding idea of directly providing habitat for fish. But the other thing that we've been testing in recent years is flow pulses to try and move some of the productivity. So the Cache Slough complex, Lower Yolo bypass, is essentially a tidal slough network, but it's also used for agricultural drainage because these are, working landscapes that are also used for different purposes. And we found that chlorophyll and zooplankton levels are quite high. Wim can elaborate on some of the feeding and production studies that he's done. But one of the issues in these areas is that there are also heavy diversions. And so a lot of that productivity during peak diversion season is going the wrong way. The net flows are going upstream away from the delta. And so a lot of the purpose of the flow pulse is to see if we can provide more natural flow patterns and perhaps subsidize downstream habitats.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add on to what Ted said. We worked with Ted's group up in that the tow drain area of the Yolo bypass in the summertime and looked at growth rates of the copepods, the most abundant ones up there. And we found they were quite a bit higher than we usually see. Most of the time, they were quite a bit higher than we usually see in the rest of the estuary. And it was related to chlorophyll concentration, and it seemed to be related to the flow pulses, but the abundance was inversely related. So basically, the flow pulses were diluting the populations even as they were growing faster. And there must be some sweet spot in there that we haven't figured out yet, where the flow is high enough to bring fresh nutrients and fresh phytoplankton in, and not so high that they just dilute the copepods out of there. But we should bear in mind that the tow drain where this is going on is tiny. You can throw a rock across it. So it's a great laboratory, sort of a living laboratory or a field laboratory, but really more of a demonstration for what you might be able to accomplish with a larger system like that.
Steve, yeah.
Yeah, again, excellent discussion here. I could talk about this all day. But the one question I had, is there anybody or any activity going on to trying to develop a food web for the Delta, either pelagic or benthic or system-wide as a whole, sort of a quantitative or even qualitative food web per se, kind of like EcoSim or anything like that?
A food web model, you mean?
Yes, food web model.
A bunch of us have kicked around ideas about that. And there was somebody at USGS in Sacramento who was a student at Sac State, and she developed an EcoPath, or I forget which version.
Yeah, it was the EcoPath, yeah.
It was EcoPath, yeah. But I don't know where that's gone. Maybe Ted knows. But otherwise, people always ask me that. Why don't you guys develop a model? And my answer is, well, I'd like to at least know a bit more about the mechanisms involved. And so I've been focusing on those. But also, I've been involved in a lot of modeling projects. So I think it would be a timely thing to do. What I have seen in the modeling work is that you often have modeling going on independent of any new research. And I think what you need is something like, if you really want to develop a decent model, it's something like a 10-year program where you have a modeling team and various research teams that interact and feed information back and forth. Because if you don't do that, then they stand alone. For example, our Delta smelt individual-based model that I worked on with Kenny Rose, we didn't have any research component. It was all, it was all done, in our computers.
So Wim, what do you think a role of the ISB could be to move this forward?
Well, stimulate interest, stimulate, what it would take, I think, is a person to lead such an effort, and not me, some other person to lead such an effort, and some funds, at least, maybe some seed money to get something off the ground that could then be supported over a reasonably long time. It takes a long time and a lot of work to develop good models, and it also takes a lot of information that we may or may not have at our fingertips.
And it's particularly challenging when food webs are changing at the speed of light. I mean, you showed shifts in food web structure from one decade to the next. So that, one question is, which food webs are we going to build models for? In what parts of the system during what eras?
Well, the last time point in there was 1993. So actually the copepod or the zooplankton food web has been static.
Yeah.
We haven't had a new introduction that I know of.
Yeah.
And people are looking. So
Ted, from your perspective, what roles could you see being played by the ISB on this topic?
Yeah, I want to echo Wim's comment about the ISB potentially being a champion for food web type studies. I'm more of a fish guy. At the same time, I recognize that we might focus maybe too much at times just on fish responses and not spend enough time understanding the basics of the food web behind it. We have plenty of examples showing that the food web is critically important, and we're underpowered at many times. I hope some of you were able to attend the recent zooplankton symposium that the Delta Science program put together, but there's a lot of good information out there based on monitoring. I think a more focused approach looking at food web interactions would be helpful.
Yeah, that said, though, you have to congratulate the IEP for having started zooplankton monitoring back in 1972. Even the Chesapeake Bay doesn't have a record that long.
Lisa, go ahead. Yeah.
So, given that we started this meeting with Laurel describing an RFP that included the ability to do some individual studies, I guess I have this question of, is the science that they're asking for incompatible with these slower processes of observations over a long time that allow you to develop things like food web structure? Is there a different structure of funding that's needed?
I think I don't think the science that would arise out of this RFP is incompatible with advancing knowledge, which is what we need to do, and therefore being more able to put together some kind of a model. But I think the actual process of doing such a modeling effort would require a more concerted and long-term effort. For years we've been getting, the funding for science in this estuary has been in little 1, 2, and sometimes 3-year dribs and drabs, well, not necessarily little amounts, but sometimes large amounts. But it's a real problem when you have to go from year to year. And, it's a real problem to keep a program going. But, if we're going to do something to develop a comprehensive model or some kind of a model, it's going to take longer.
Laurel, we'd like to hear from you on this.
Yes, I was looking for a hand raise function, but I don't think Zoom has one of those. I would back up what Wim just said, but additionally add that one of the areas that we're seeking proposals in this solicitation is science synthesis. And that might be problematic in certain situations where our monitoring data in, say, the South Bay or the southern part of the Delta might not be adequate. But I do think that the process of creating a model based on synthesis of existing data is well within the scope of this RFP.
We don't know this newly formulated ISB. We don't know what directions we're going. This session today is just a starting place for discussing lots of potential topics that we might review or champion. But I can imagine if we decided that this is something that we wanted to take on, that an important role would be to do an assessment of where do we stand in terms of understanding mechanistically the processes that Wim is talking about. What's the level of understanding that's required to start building food web models? What are our conceptual models of what food web structure looks like? What do the conceptual models say about changes in food webs seasonally, wet years versus dry years, different geographic regions of the Delta, estuary, river, ocean system? I could imagine a document where we do a fairly comprehensive assessment of our conceptual model, and then what are the really big gaps in knowledge that we need to take that conceptual model and turn it into a working model. And then finally, what would be the potential uses of that kind of model? Why would we want to do this? Why is it worth the effort? And what are the big management related questions that require knowledge of food web structure and how it changes in response to climate, land use change, nutrient inputs, whatever. So I can imagine an effort that might take a year or two from this group. But I think we need to hear from people like Laurel how this fits into the Delta Science Program strategy for funding science, and for the practicing biologists who are working on producers, consumers at different levels in the Delta and downstream. I guess I'd kind of like to hear from other members of the ISB, where do you think this topic falls in the hierarchy of potential topics we could work on in the next year or two? And maybe it's too early to say. We need to go through a number of sessions like this.
I guess I would say number one is, as you mentioned up, Tim, in the very beginning, is that this is one of our fundamental science recommendations in the non-native species report, was to develop a comprehensive food web model that was also sensitive to the environmental drivers, such as temperature and other things, so that you could look at it. And as Jay has always argued, is something to the effect that models don't give you answers, but they're a good starting point for looking at gaps of information and looking at sensitivity of parameters and influences and things like that. And I think that's why we're having this discussion, is to find out, is there something here that we as a board, for either in our thematic reviews, is worth delving into in a much more either intense way or broader way. So,
Diane, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I had some questions, and again, we all tend to look at topics from the lens of what we know. And when I saw how much change there was from these marshes to the current system, I imagine that the concentrations of dissolved organic matter greatly changed in this transition, all the levees, and I know that in some areas of research, there's a lot of consideration of how natural organic matter attenuates UV light and then affects the UV light regime that can affect zooplankton and where they are, when they're abundant. And do we know anything about whether that's changing seasonally? Because that can be another constraint in terms of what the aquatic milieu is like. And I assume that in your detrital budgets, you weren't including the dissolved form of organic matter. Is that true, or was it included?
The way we did that calculation is we took numbers from a meta-analysis that Juice Sabrian and Carlos Duarte did a long time ago, where they looked at studies where people measured the fate of organic carbon produced by different producers, like vascular marsh plants and benthic microalgae, and so they estimated the fractions that went into production of detritus, and I think implicit in that was the assumption that DOC was part of that calculation. We know a little bit about the bioavailability of DOC coming in from the rivers, and it's pretty recalcitrant. I mean, we asked that question: what's the energy value of DOC delivered to the estuary from the rivers? But in terms of UV attenuation, I mean, this is a really muddy system. Is that an issue in a really muddy system?
Well, probably not then. But if it's okay, well, thanks for clarifying that.
I mean, we're talking about photic depths of maybe a meter.
Okay, probably not important.
Bob, yeah.
So Jim and others, Jim, I'd like to come back to your kind of original question. We thought that this topic was one that we as a board could get behind for longer term. And as many of you know, I guess I'm predisposed to say yes. I think it would be a great organizing topic because I think there's so many facets of this. If they were well organized, these facets could actually coalesce into a much greater understanding of the system and how it's working, which is vitally important, how it's working, but also how it might be modified or kind of restored in such a way that you could move the system towards food webs and food web processes, trophic processes that actually have good management outcomes. So I would say that I would keep this one on the table for now and probably keep it squarely on the table and take a good hard look at it, especially as we go through other topics. So I think it could be a great organizing topic for so many things that we might want to look at going forward.
Bob knows this, but I didn't say anything about it. In this paper that we've submitted recently, we did a third scenario of primary production in the Delta. And that third scenario is if we meet California's goals for restoring tidal marsh habitats, non-tidal marsh habitats, and floodplain habitats. And so we have assessments of what attaining those habitat restoration goals would mean in terms of carbon fixation by photosynthesis, but nothing about what that would mean for production at higher trophic levels. So that's an example of if we had an appropriate food web model, we could transform habitat acreage increases to potential fish production increases. But I agree with you, Bob, that it's an approach that is synthetic, right? It's an approach towards synthesizing many different kinds of information.
Oh, absolutely. And I think as Wim had said earlier, is that if there's a good, strong leadership on this, there's no telling how far we could actually go towards, doing something that would have positive outcomes for many, many years to come. And, it could be a great catalyst. It really could.
So I'll jump.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I come from the perspective of a landscape ecologist and an ecological modeler, and it seems to me that this is exactly the time to start thinking about a model that works more at a larger scale in terms of dimensions, where because there's all this data, you could start conceptualizing the model, start with a conceptual model, help to identify where the gaps are, and then start exploring more details via smaller studies or calls for different kinds of data. But if you sit down now and see what you have, it will help identify what the gaps are. And as a sensitivity analysis, as Steve mentioned, would be really important to figure out where the potential changes could be. So I agree with Bob to keep this on the table. We haven't seen all the different ideas, but food webs are critical to this system, and a modeling approach would help you sort it out a bit.
Wim.
Yeah, I'm having a little deja vu here. We've been down this particular road before years ago. I think it was at the behest of the ISB or maybe its predecessor. Or was its predecessor, because I was on it. That we needed conceptual models for all the various components of the system. And so people started working on those, and they kind of came dribbling out over time. And I don't think they really had much of an impact. And I think the reason is that it wasn't actually a concerted effort. It was an effort to produce conceptual models, period. And a conceptual model is only really useful. I mean, really, I think it's mainly useful to those who build it, because it gets them to organize their own thoughts and their own ideas and predictions and start thinking about what do we need to know and how do we model this more formally. So that's why I suggested that you need a team that has some longevity or some persistence over time with, again, yes, as Bob said, a strong leader. I think that's the way to make progress on this. Conceptual models are essential, but they're alone. They don't do much.
I guess I'm also having deja vu on this topic too. When I think back, it was over 40 years ago, we started working in Canada on some very large watersheds, not as big as the Delta, but still 20,000 square kilometers or more, and asking the question, what was the biophysical basis for fish production coming out of these big watersheds? And we took a food web approach using carbon as the currency. And the one thing that I guess I learned at the time, this was in around 1980, somewhere in my attic, I probably still have the original conceptual models that we put together, which fit on a little kind of 11 by 18 piece of paper and maybe had a dozen boxes and some arrows and so on. But we did what Wim had suggested is we started out with the conceptual models, but we also had ongoing research to inform those models and fill in the gaps. And every year we would sit down at the end of the year and we would revise our conceptual models and put in actually some numbers here and there. And it was quite surprising to me that at the end of probably 6 to 7, 8 years out, that we had a lot of numbers and we had a conceptual model that was just greatly expanded with numerous boxes and arrows and fluxes and amounts and stuff going on, that we could actually begin to see how those big watersheds worked to actually produce fish, produce Atlantic salmon. And in the process, we began to discover some of the more fine details that allowed us to pinpoint what was actually driving the Atlantic salmon production in many of those rivers. And it was really this marriage of the modeling, combined with the ongoing on-the-ground research, and as well as what we knew already about the system, and revisiting it from year to year, that really allowed us within a decade to come up with some really strong answers that to this day are used in Quebec and in Eastern Canada to try and manage those fish populations. So anyway, that's my deja vu because, these things, when you first start them, they seem almost impossible. But through time, and especially these days where we have so much in the way of existing information and great people out there doing the work, if there was some way to kind of organize and synergize, all these efforts, we could really, I think, see something positive come out of this probably within a decade, if not sooner. So I'll be quiet now, but that was my deja vu.
So Bob, I've got a question for you and then a question for Laurel. So in that particular case, long-term team study, annual updates and reviews, what was the model for funding that? And then Laurel, do you see that model fitting and being consistent with the goals of the Delta Science Program?
Well, the funding for us was largely in the beginning was private. That we had endowments and we had a cooperative program between the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the government of Quebec, and a number of universities in Eastern Canada. And the endowment really came out of Johnson & Johnson. Stuart Johnson was when he owned Johnson, or was the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, believed he loved Atlantic salmon, and he was willing to foot the bill for this in the beginning. And then later on, it was the National Science Foundation and other kind of traditional funding sources came in, to help pick up the tab, once we had proof of concept. And it was really the others kind of coming in later. It was the private money in the beginning, which allowed us to do things quickly and to do things that would never in those days have gotten through the review process ever. We were doing things that everyone was telling us could not be done. And we often had proof of concept within a year or two because we had the private money. And then once we had that, then the other traditional sources started to come in and, really made it fly.
So Laurel, is this kind of science consistent with your vision for the Delta Science Program?
I would say definitely yes. And it also fits in really well right now. Hold on, I just needed to make sure my microphone was attached. It also fits in really well with ongoing conversations within the Integrated Modeling Steering Committee that are happening currently, that are focused on working towards building a virtual collaboratory to come together and achieve data synthesis and produce new models that will address questions like this. So I think, I definitely think this is well within the mission of the Delta Science Program, and there would be a lot of interest in such a model. And I would say it goes beyond the Delta Science Program to the Integrated Modeling Steering Committee, consists of people from many different state agencies and nonprofits. And I think there would be a lot of coalescence around this goal.
So Steve, I think we've used up our time slot here, huh?
Well, yes, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess. I want to thank Jim for putting this together, and of course, Jim and particularly Wim and Ted, who have again come to us on a panel and presented some exciting information. I sense there's a lot of excitement on this topic amongst board members, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. It seems like something there seems to be a really good movement forward on. This is achieved exactly what we had intended, was to explore a topic, do some brainstorming, and see if it's worth the board effort to continue to pursue it as a possible thematic review. And so we'll definitely come back to this. Are there any public comments on this, Edmund?
There are none, but I just want to remind the public, if you can't find the raise hand function, you can also email us at disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. At this time, we have no public comments.
Okay, thanks. I want to point out that Joe Fernando has joined us. And Joe, do you have any new declarations?
No new declarations, but just also one more comment that I remember when we were doing fish and flows, we discussed about the food web, but we didn't include that too much in that review. So this is a very nice rekindling of those discussions those days.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. We did recommend the integrated modeling approach that connected the to the physical driving forces to the biological mechanisms, and as Laurel said, the integrated modeling steering committee, we do have at some stage looking forward to a presentation from them as an update on the status of where they're going, because we feel we had some part in initiating that effort through that Fish and Flows report. So I think we'll move on directly to our next topic item. If you need to take a break, just disappear and take a break, because we want to get done by 1:30. The next item, item 4, is an actual action item. And hopefully you've had a chance over the past 2 weeks to review the revision to the invasive species or non-native species thematic review. And what we're looking for today is to see if we're ready to take a vote on approving the document, approving at the content level. And what that means is when we look at the content of the report and are the basic findings, the basic recommendations good enough to be approved with the and with any modifications we might want to make in terms of the today, and with and then granting the editorial, allowing us to do some other edits. If people have other edits, we want to do some more edits. Jay and I have agreed to do the editing. Jay, if you don't know Jay, he's a superb editor, and he can take anything, at least anything I draft, and turn it into something that sounds reasonable. He did re-edit the executive summary already, and has agreed to help with the re-editing of the rest of it without changing the content. So I guess what we're looking for is just a discussion now. I've seen some other folks have sent us some individual comments, Tom and Jim, but let's talk about the content of the report and seeing if we're ready to vote for that to move forward. If it is approved, then what we would do is revise it based on any recommendations we get, go through an editing process, and then it eventually comes out as a board report, which would include authors from the previous board who have stepped down, who also have had a major input on this. The current version, as I mentioned before, is a result of work that Lisa and John Weens and I put in to try and take into account the recommendations that you have put forward. I failed to add Tom's comment on microbiology, which he has then reinserted again. Thanks, Tom. And so I open it up for discussion at this time. Lisa.
So I have a comment, and it a little bit follows on our past conversation too, in that, a lot of invasive species introductions are based on human behavior, not just climate change or something like that. And that, I know you all recognize that, but it doesn't come across, say, in the introduction at all. Maybe where you talk about climate change, we could mention this link to human behavior as well, and think about whether there are different management mechanisms when you have different drivers of introductions. So that's the only thing I think that's substantive. I have some other comments for you. I'm really glad to see the executive summary. I think that helps a lot guide people through what's in the body of the report. And I have some other minor comments, but yeah, I think to me as a social scientist, that's a big gap. And I would bring that up again regarding food webs and things too, but we'll get there in the future.
Well, thanks, Lisa. Let me remind people what we actually did in response to your comments from the last time. There was a comment to put an executive summary together, which we did. And there was also a suggestion to reduce the number of recommendations, which we did from, I think, 13 down to 6 or 7. There was a discussion about prioritizing the recommendations, and rather than prioritize them like 1 through 7, we categorized them into topics of improving the science capabilities, prioritizing management actions, shift and focus to environmental level, consideration of future changes, and actual implementation. And then there was a suggestion also that we try and identify specific entities that might take action. We have in one case, we talked about the, I forget what it's called, DSIIC, that would have, that's an invasive species coordinating committee. I can't remember the exact acronym, that they would take the action on one of those, but we felt that the actions were broad enough that it would be difficult to target any one specific entity to take that, take on a specific recommendation. So that's how we kind of responded in a very general sense to that. And okay.
Just to echo Lisa's point a little bit, in my edits last night, I think I added something about prevention. And I think that's where the human behavior is really important. You know, how do you manage ballast water and recreational fishermen when they're bait boxes and all kinds of things like that. And the aquarium industry, you know, all these sort of classical things on human behavior and invasive species. I'm not sure if we want to modify the report to include more of that, but I think it's really important. It's certainly an emphasis of current management. Maybe not as organized an emphasis as we might want.
Yeah, when we talk about the, and Lisa, I'm going to ask you about this as well. When we talk about the specific steps, which is risk assessment and prevention and, you know, early detection and those kind of steps along the way and control, we do talk about prevention in there, but I think maybe that's the area we could beef up the sort of the human behavior as part of the driving forces in that we could add that in there.
Yeah, I really wasn't thinking of anything too dramatic in terms of changes, but just sort of recognizing that that's a driver just because it does have management implications. So I think just a few choice words here and there could probably do it, nothing major. Because I think until you have a specific invader you're thinking about, it's probably not good to speculate about exactly how you would deal with it, right? You know, you need to know the pathway of introduction that you'd be trying to interrupt before you can really say much.
Tom? Tom, do you have any?
Took me a second to unmute. Yeah, I'm still struggling with the problem of the co-equal goal that talks about let me look at the words here again, protecting, restoring, and enhancing the delta. You know, when you look at the maps that Jim showed, there's no way we can go back. And it seems to me in this report, this is probably an opportunity to at least address that issue, because invasive species, particularly with climate change, are really inevitable. And I think at some point the policymakers are going to have to address the inadequacy of that goal, because it really sets us up for failure if you follow it religiously. That we just can't. I mean, there's no way we can restore the delta, for example. They just pick one of those words. So I'd just like to see that that challenge or problem addressed in the report.
It is a little bit included in finding 3, but I think you're right. The emphasis on it could be increased a little bit, because it is a discussion that I think is important for the public and policymakers to think about, to put a little bit more forward.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Tom. I know in the writing team's discussion, we seem to talk more about that than any other topic, I think. And I think that, and maybe by the time we got down to this report, it doesn't come out as strongly as we had talked about it. I will read the first sentence of the recommendation number 3, which is the DISB recommends that management needs to move beyond individual species management to address how to set ecosystem goals and recognition of an ever-changing species pool in high uncertainty. And that was kind of meant to deal with that, but then we go on and talk about how that applies to an invasives. So I think that's an area that we could, both within the text as well as in the summary, emphasize a little bit more along the lines that you're talking about. Add a couple sentences of how that is a fundamental to the co-equal goal.
Yeah. I just think it needs a little more emphasis.
Steve, one way to deal with this would be to just have a brief reference to what Peter Moyle calls reconciliation ecology rather than restoration ecology. And maybe that would solve the problem, or at least address the problem.
I think you're right, but I can't tell you, and unfortunately I'm the only member of the writing team I think that's still around. It was John and Joy and Dick. We talked about those terms, and we talked about reconciliation ecology. We talked about novel ecosystems, and every one of those terms, as you probably are aware, has some differing of opinion on the value of those terms. And so we try to go more fundamental and avoid some of those terms. Maybe we can say what you mean in words rather than an individual term.
All right, so you've gone down this road.
Oh, yes. Well, you know, novel ecosystem is probably the one that gets the most attention, but there was really, and there was debate amongst the writing team of whether or not we ought to bring that term up at all. And some were vehemently opposed to it. Some were, I shouldn't tell you what, you know, the ongoings and behind closed doors, but there was a lot of debate about that use of that term, because it's debated in the literature as well, as you know. So, and rather than get controversial, we thought we would focus on what's needed for the Delta and not use the terms, but talk about the concepts and ideas.
So this suggests to me, I'm looking now at the place where you talk about novel systems. Maybe at the beginning, you should have a short paragraph discussing this challenge of restoration versus, and you could introduce the other terms. But putting that up front, I think would be really helpful to the readers.
You're talking back in where we talk about restoration.
Well, I'm not sure, I hadn't thought of it, but I looked at the section that's about novel ecosystems, and it's kind of buried at the end of one section. But to me, those kind of things are always important. And it starts saying ecological restoration is a long-term process, but you're probably not going to be able to restore this system to anything like it was. So maybe that paragraph should say the goal of restoration is, you know, it's a vision, but we probably won't ever reach that goal. Instead, you know, there's other ways to get the ecosystem processes that we're interested in. And so looking at the processes and interactions rather than restoration per se might be important. Anyway, it's not a big deal, but I think these comments that have been raised are important to think about what the ultimate ability is to get to some healthier system than what is there now.
Any words that you have you'd like to send me?
Okay, I actually have a paper on this very topic, so.
I don't need a paper, just a couple of sentences.
Yeah.
That'd be very useful, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think these are important points. And again, the report is very good. There's lots of detail, but I think the big messages that are now encapsulated better in the executive summary and ordering of the recommendations helps a lot.
Any other thoughts or comments?
I have a general comment, and this is going to come up a lot. And I just had three small suggested changes that I sent to you, Steve. But one of them is the use of the word delta. What do we mean when we use the word delta? Because it's used in so many different ways. I mean, there's the legal delta. People talk about the Bay Delta system. People talk about the San Francisco estuary. And these are not very well-defined terms of geography. And so I think it might help a reader have a sense from you, and it wouldn't take much, to define what you mean from a geographic perspective about geography. And the reason why that's important is that many of the species, both native and non-native, are mobile, and their geographic location changes, and they aren't always in the legal delta. Sometimes they come in, sometimes they go out. So I was unclear about what the word delta means in this report, and I think a couple of sentences could solve that problem, or maybe one sentence.
Yeah, I think in our second paragraph in the body, we say the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, here after delta. We're talking about the broad system throughout whenever we use the word delta.
But I mean, does it go into San Pablo Bay? I mean, there's species that migrate between San Pablo Bay and the first order part of the delta. When I read Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, I don't know what that means geographically. I don't know what the bounds are.
Okay, so we can put in a more explicit definition there, what we mean.
You know, there's this quote that the San Francisco Bay Delta system is the most invaded estuary in the world. Most of those species are in salt water.
Right.
We add a map to the report.
I've never seen one.
Okay, so we can certainly make that more extreme. I know in that particular sentence when we talked about the system being one of the most invaded, we were very careful in making sure we meant the whole system on that particular quote, because I agree with you. That's where most of the invasions have been recorded, at least in ballast water, et cetera. But
another comment that I made is I don't think it's essential to address. It's just, I think, a really interesting academic question. The report talks about climate change as a driver of future changes that's going to facilitate successful colonizations by non-native species. And when you talk about climate, you're talking about warming and sea level rise. But I think the natural variability of the climate system maybe can be as important as changes in the climate system. And so wet years versus dry years, for example, prolonged droughts. But I think the most extreme example is these mega floods that have a recurrence of about 150 years. And we're due for one. The last one was in 1862. And the entire Central Valley of California was underwater. The city of Sacramento was abandoned as the state capital because it was underwater. The whole Bay Delta system was fresh water, and the outflow was so strong that there were no tidal currents in the estuary. So imagine what an event like that does to biological communities. And it basically is going to remove everything except probably some microbes in the sediments. So what's going to determine how communities are reestablished after an event like that? So maybe that doesn't fit in this report, but when I think about responses to climate change, I also think about responses to natural variability of the climate system. And this is part of the natural variability of the climate system. And it will have a profound effect on biological communities.
yeah, I agree, and we can expand on what we did say, but we did say that of course, warming is expected to shift species distribution and allow non-natives to invade new areas. And then we said of arguably greater concern are extreme events like floods, droughts, and storms, and finished off a paragraph, even citing your 2011 paper. So,
or maybe just add mega floods in that list.
Oops.
And, there's this great paper that Lynn Ingram and Mike Dettinger wrote about this in Scientific American. It's a fascinating paper.
No, I think that's a really good point about the extreme events in particular, and the perhaps increased frequency of extreme events that we're going to see.
There's kind of a ratcheting effect that seems to be happening with droughts, and a similar kind of maybe a different kind of reset event occurs with huge mega floods. Although I think if we got a repeat of the 1860s floods today, it will be very different in terms of its effects by the Delta.
But that's kind of the exact point, Jay, is that can we manage for better recovery, or like a future that doesn't only include invasive species after one of these floods? So that, yeah. I think that's kind of the crux of the management question.
Any other thoughts? Okay, if not, what we'd be looking for is a motion, something to the effect that to approve the content of the report with the agreed upon edits. That means all of the edits and things we talked about today that I'm sure Edmund has carefully annotated, and to designate the leadership team, Jay and I, to make those edits, and as well as any other edits that don't change the content of the report. So we need a motion, someone to motion that and someone to second that.
Is there someone else that wants to sort of volunteer to go over the edits and rewriting? That would be, it's always good to have more.
Yeah, I'll volunteer to do it.
Okay, great. And we'd need a...
I'll move that we vote on content of the report, or approve the content of the report pending minor edits.
I'll second.
Okay, very good. I'm required to have a roll call vote. And Jay, just say yes if you approve the motion, or no if you don't. Jay? I think that's a...
Aye.
Yes. Okay, Jim?
Muted aye.
Yes.
Virginia?
Yes.
Joe?
Yes.
Tanya?
Yes.
Tom?
Aye.
Diane?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
And Lisa?
Yes.
Fantastic. I say yes too. So we're going to go ahead and put this together. If anyone wants to do any editing and send this to us, we're more than happy to take any edits. I know we're expecting some written lines from a few of you. I do have Jim's written comments and some of Tom's paragraphs he sent me that are in line with what they said today. We'll make sure the rest of the writing team gets those. And then we will put forward and put together a final draft, which I then believe it goes to for production. And we also at some stage then need to consider next steps in this. And some of the next steps, one of the next steps is we make a formal presentation to the Stewardship Council. That's part of our responsibility at some stage. I think they're talking January or February is our next appearance there. And be happy to have someone join me at that presentation. We will then we put together sort of a 2-page flyer on this to help to advertise that this document exists. And then we as a group should talk about other avenues we want to make sure that this gets out to and gets the proper exposure. We can do that at a subsequent meeting. One of the other, yes, Edmund.
Can we just check to make sure there are no public comments really quick? So can you just make a request to make sure there's no public comments before we finish next step discussions?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Are there any public comments?
yeah, we've been monitoring and there has been no public comments on this topic.
Thanks. I was supposed to do that before the motion, but thanks. Thanks for keeping us honest here, Edmund.
Steve, just as a suggestion, some of this might be a good session or a topic for the Delta Science Conference coming up, and I'm not sure of the deadlines that they mentioned some of the deadlines for getting our oar in the water for that, but some of the things that we're talking about both here and in the science needs assessment, I think would merit, the kind of broader exposure and discussion that the science conference will have, and we might want to take that opportunity to foment that kind of discussion.
That's a good discussion. The deadline is November 23rd.
That's roughly 10 days. Is anyone, would anyone like to volunteer to help put one together and present it? I don't see anyone jumping up and down. I think we could also I'll talk to John Weens as well, who's been very active in this. And Jay, maybe you and I could talk about it, I guess, and see if it's something we want to do. It's Laurel, does it just require a title or an abstract? Or I guess we have something.
An abstract as well as a title, yes.
And these talks are 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20?
I should know this. I don't know this off the top of my head. I think it's up to the organizers of the sessions, because I know some people are planning more panel style sessions and others are planning more traditional sessions. But I would say probably around 15 minutes, including questions for most.
Okay, one other thought is that John Weens and I, in the last stages of this process, talked about the possibility of putting this forward in some highly reduced, focused form as a publication as well. As you know, the board has done this before with our adaptive management. We did it with our rapid response paper, and there may have been another one that we did as well. So I'm going to put that on the table now and let you think about it. If it's something you'd like to be involved in, usually when we go to a publication stage, since you're all now involved in this particular report, you're all invited to participate in the publication. You're also, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, that's fine as well. It's not a requirement to be involved, but it's an invitation if you want to, if we go that route. And then the authors who are involved would be part of that. So as an official publication. And I would do the same as offer that to previous board members who felt that they've put a lot of effort into this, and give them that opportunity to join in, and if we go that route. So we don't need to decide now, but just let you know that that's something we might want to think about down the road, and pick a section of it that we think might be really of value to put into a publication. Okay, any other thoughts or input on that? Okay, thanks. We'll move on to the next topic, which is the preparation for upcoming Delta ISB meetings. Our next meeting is scheduled for December 11th. I want to first talk the specifics of that meeting and then open the conversation to about board activities in general, given the compensation kind of things that have come forward. For our next meeting, we've thought we would do an update on the Delta Science Needs Assessment as part of our ongoing, half of the meeting being about reviews that are underway. And I think we're still, Jay, are we still in line for that kind of timetable?
I think so. I think we really need to do that. Whether we're ready or not, we should be ready by then.
Okay, and the next topic we thought we would hit is harmful algal blooms, and Diane has agreed to take the lead on that. Do you want to tell us what's happening?
Well, we've been successful with both Hans Pearl, who's a internationally known expert on this, and Peggy Lehman have agreed to be panelists, and as of earlier today, the third guest hadn't agreed, but I haven't kept up with my email today. So we have a panelists and a topic, and we are going to have a meeting with them that Edmund will help coordinate to discuss the approach for the panel discussion. So that's where we are.
And
I think that it'll be a really interesting topic to learn more about more broadly what the issues are and what's being done here in the Delta.
Diane, have you thought about themes or topics or messages that you want to get out of this discussion?
Well, one of the themes that I've thought about, but I don't know if this is the right theme, is are there lessons learned from other environments that can help inform what to be on the lookout for and how to approach the problems? Just what I'm saying is I don't know how acute the problem is in the Delta now, but I know there may be lessons from other areas that could really inform how to proceed, how to think about the problem.
Could I make a suggestion, something for you to think about? I think one of the these blooms are getting bad in the Delta. And,
okay.
I mean, they're recurrent. They weren't present 25 years ago. They're recurrent. They seem to be getting bigger, especially during drought years and as it gets warmer. But one of the really important aspects of this that we don't talk much about is human health effects of these toxic cyanobacterial blooms. I mean, the state of California deals with these by putting a sign up that says, "Don't go near the water." I mean, surely we can do better than that. And I think if we can develop an assessment of what the risks are, I think that would move the discussion in a direction that it's not going. I remember reading a paper a couple of years ago. It was an analysis of the spatial distribution of liver cancer as a function of proximity to freshwater systems that have cyanobacterial blooms. And there's an association. And we don't talk about this.
There is a lot that is unknown in terms of the drinking water literature about the role of these toxins and how in the treatment area. I don't think any of the board members the panel members can address that, but drinking water isn't so much the issue in the Delta. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
Well, it is a
for example, say that again.
It is a source, but what about aerosols? I mean, what about
and seafood consumption?
One of the areas.
Yes. Well, there is as I said, that is to my knowledge, is a broadly unknown, or we need to I think invite someone else as well to address that. Is that that's my impression.
Well, I think that Hans can talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe ask him if there's somebody who's a specialist in this particular topic. But
it is certainly true that the approach of just putting up signs is common not only in the Bay Delta area, but many other areas. And then there's a social dimension about that that we talk about of this phenomena. If you cry wolf too often, and then there's no bad outcome, people ignore those signs. And how do you deal with that? Because that can discourage people from taking appropriate action in terms of recreational activities, for example.
There's a large body of information available from Western Lake Erie on microcystis and drinking water implications. NOAA puts out a formal forecast of harmful algal blooms because the Toledo drinking water comes right out of the western shore of Lake Erie, which has a tremendous harmful algal blooms over the last decade or so, because presumably because of the zebra mussel and quagga mussel infestation. And there's a lot of interest in the human health effects of that, also related to the fish consumption as well, and has been done on whether or not microcystis can persist if fish consume it in some way or form, and does it consist into the flesh or the meat that people eat. I think the result's kind of negative, but I know that a lot of work's been done on that in laboratories. But so there might be people in that area that could to give you some of the human health aspects of at least microcystis, and also dealing with the questions that, as you know, that not all blooms are necessarily have the same level of toxins in the blooms, and the toxin production and what triggers toxin production is also an important area that determines whether some blooms of the same concentration, let's say, or same productivity as are harmful or not. So.
There's been a change in discussion around the Delta in the last decade or so that is pushing us to think about the words that are used, the Delta as a place, the communities that live in the Delta and the communities that recreate in the Delta. So much of the work that's been done on the Delta has been focused on the ecosystem, but this is a potential impact on humans that, as far as I can tell, we're not considering seriously.
I think what maybe Diane's afraid of is that the science isn't mature on that, and so it might not be as satisfying. But I think this is a good suggestion. And if I could make another suggestion that is also hard to address, and that is, I find there's a lot of activity around this idea of real-time monitoring and quick response kind of things. I don't find that. I mean, that's great, but what about preventing them to begin with? And so I feel like we don't have enough discussion about, is there any effective thing that we can do that can prevent blooms? And there's really very poor understanding of that, much to my chagrin. And so one thing I do know of is that some of the management practices that we're promoting on farms to retain nutrients is generating a higher runoff of soluble phosphorus. And so that could be one thing that, if that's happening in the Delta, I have no idea. It's happening near Lake Erie, it's happening in the Chesapeake Bay. If that is contributing, like, that's the kind of thing like you can actually do something about. So I would encourage you to think about if there are any of these management levers.
Well, it sounds to me like we have also a lot of excitement and interest on this topic. So,
and just to jump in, and there's a discussion as to whether it's primarily nutrients or is it primarily climate change, where we have ice out happening earlier, we have warmer conditions, we have different ways in which these water bodies stratify, and is that the main driver that the increase is so pervasive across many different regions? So is it nutrients? Is it climate? Is itself a point of discussion? Again, this is not my area of expertise, but I'm glad to lead a discussion.
Thanks for doing it again, Diane. And again, this will be one of those topics that we can brainstorm and explore, see whether there's an interest in continuing and exploring it further. So thanks for that. I want to move on to just one more item, and that is the our activity level. And as all of you know, that we decided to go to a 2-hour meeting and a minimalist activity, I want to say, based on the fact that it was all 100% volunteer. And as you know, there's been a policy put forward to, we think it's temporary, we think, and to provide at least some compensation to folks. Given that, is there any, what does the board feel about in terms of our activity levels? Do we want to expand it in some way or form, more meetings, different topics covered, get folks involved in some of the other reviews, like the monitoring review, and move forward with that review in particular. And if so, what level do we want to move forward at? And given what you know now, any thoughts?
Steve, I'd like to know what the Stewardship Council's expectations are of us given this big change. I mean, is the expectation of business as usual?
No, when we've talked to, we, meaning particularly Jay and I, leadership, have talked to the council about this, they absolutely fully understand our paragraph that we put forward in terms of, that's on the beginning of each of our agendas about their board's reduced activities and curtailment, as we said, of the board activities. They understand, I believe, that this new level of compensation will not fully bring us back to whole, and that we'll still have a curtailment of activities. So I think they understand our inability to work at the levels that we used to work under the current situation and under the proposed situation. And I don't know if we can get any more specific than that.
I think Steve captured that well. So the policy that we have proposed right now is hopefully a temporary policy while we seek a more long-term solution, and the level of compensation is not comparable to the level of compensation that we were previously offering. And so it's not our expectation strictly that that the board will go back to exactly the level of work that it was doing prior to this change. I think that's open for discussion with all of you, and that all of you are welcome to have a voice as board members in deciding how to balance the compensation that we are able to offer and the amount of time that you're therefore able to commit. So I think it's appropriate for Steve to be raising it at this meeting and for all of us to discuss it together as a group.
Steve, one thing I'd like to point out is that right now, because of the COVID restrictions, the 2-hour thing is not a huge imposition, but if we got into meeting face to face, then the 2-hour thing pretty much goes away. It becomes, well, particularly for those who are traveling long distances. I mean, we're talking several days of commitment.
I agree with you, and if we're still under the, I want to say, proposed level of compensation, and I think it's, clearly it would be very difficult, I think, for most people to commit a full day or commit to any travel under that level of compensation. It's really would be mostly volunteer time, 90% volunteer time if they came to an all-day meeting.
Hey, Steve, and all and everyone else. I guess I would say, just to keep the discussion going here, is I feel very comfortable at this level going forward. I don't see any reason to increase the amount of activity right now unless you have really a vested interest, something already invested in a lot of these reports. But until there's a permanent solution, I feel personally comfortable just staying at this level of activity without compensation.
Any other thoughts?
I would say that for me, the COVID adds a whole nother level of uncertainty in terms of my other responsibilities as a faculty member and some other commitments that I've made. So it's hard right now to really envision what May and June will look like. So I'm comfortable with what we're doing right now. And yeah, so having a big change in the next 4 or 5 months would be hard in terms of increased level of activity. It would be hard for me to commit to that, just given the challenges that we're dealing with as academics here at the University of Colorado.
I think when I look at our reviews, I do appreciate you all volunteering over the past 2 weeks and committing your time to review the invasive species report. That was really a valuable volunteer contribution to get that done and out the door. I think in terms of ongoing activities, we have the science needs assessment, and Tom and Jay and I are working on that, but we do want to bring that to the board for their input, and at some stage, and then but we'll be bringing it to the board at least at some level in December. It may just be an enhanced outline for us to talk about. But the big one that's sort of on the table is our monitoring enterprise review. These are our own initiatives. I might back up and say, if the council asks us to review a report with a certain deadline, that's going to be a challenge. And under this present circumstances, we do tend to review things, science action agendas, things like that, and ecosystem reviews, things like that, that they come forward and say, can you have a look at this? Or will you please have a look at this? And our answer is, in my view, our answer is going to have to be, we need a really long timetable in order to respond to those requests, because of our level of activity has dropped by about 80 to 90%. So I think that's, and we're going to firm up those numbers so we know exactly what those are, but that's my estimate. The one activity, the monitoring review, is something that is, where the science program has put in $500,000 to this, and the board itself has spent almost 2 years working on. And that one is collecting dust right now. That one probably has some sort of a expiration date on it in terms of being valid, because the monitoring inventory that was done is ended and the inventory changes. But that's going to take a lot of effort. And I don't know if there's the next step in the process. What would normally be done is we would ask for people to volunteer, paid volunteers, to join a writing team and take the leadership in taking it to the next step. Usually that would be 3 members who would be 3, no more than 5. I think we can go to no more than 4, to take that responsibility on and carry it to the next step. And the next step was, we had planned to do interviews agency personnel and get their input. I think, I'm trying to recall, maybe Edmund can tell me, did we finish a written survey yet, or was that still in progress?
Yeah, we have survey results that have been analyzed, but the next step was just interviews. I'm not sure, maybe as a potential next step, Steve, maybe we could do a future presentation of what's been done with the monitoring review and kind of share findings that we have already just from the inventory and what the contractor did. It just may be a start to help facilitate discussion of where to go, so people are on the same page of what's been done. Because I know there's a lot of material out there that it just may be useful to summarize to help get this discussion going.
And who would do that, Edmund? I think it's a great idea.
Staff can do it, since we were managing the contract for the contractor, or we can see if a former member would be willing to come back to share what's been done.
All right, I think that's if anyone has any comments to that, but I think that's a great idea to get to do it exactly as you say. Have staff try and put something together and maybe ask a former board member if they're willing to volunteer their time to come. And I would say Vince, of course, who knows all of this by the back of his hand and largely led the effort at the last time. And then we could schedule that at, if we're going to keep the same schedule moving forward, then maybe we would schedule that for our January meeting. That seem reasonable? Because the science needs assessment review, if we keep up the same process of one exciting conversation and on a new topic and 1 hour talking about existing boring reviews, then we're covered for next one. And then in January, we would take this as our review topic and then think about what we might want to do for the science discussion. All right, I'm seeing some smiling and nodding of heads, so and some thumbs up. So let's move forward with that. And so we move on to item 6. We're almost done. Any items for follow-up, Edmund?
Yes, so at today's meeting, Dr. Laurel Larson indicated that the Delta Science Program, in collaboration with USBR, has released a proposal solicitation, and she suggested that if you have colleagues who may be interested, to please forward her message on. In addition, at today's meeting, you guys took action to approve the content of the non-native species report with agreed upon edits that were captured today. So if you want to provide written comments based on what you said today or suggestions for edits, please do so. I don't think we've discussed a potential deadline, Steve. Do you have a suggestion of when to get comments back to staff to share with the writing team?
I'm saying I'm going to be generous and say 2 weeks.
Okay,
I mean, now that it's
2 weeks.
Yeah, now that it's approved, I'm not sure if steamrolling ahead to get this done by December 1st or December 12th is going to matter an awful lot.
Mm-hmm. And I have for this that Jay, Steve, and Tom are going to take the lead in preparing the report for production. In terms of next steps, there was discussion of submitting an abstract for the Bay Delta Science Conference, and I'd have that as a potential follow-up item for you, Steve, to follow up on preparing an abstract for a presentation.
And I would amend that to say with Jay and Tom.
With Jay and Tom. All right, correction made. In terms of December, there'll be a focus on the science needs assessment. A cleaned up outline should be released before that meeting for everyone to review. And Diane McKnight is leading a panel discussion on harmful algal blooms. And there was a lot of great input today to focus on or to consider human health effects along with where we are with science in terms of prevention. So Diane will take that into consideration as we organize the panel that's coming up. For January, I'd have this as a follow-up item for me to help organize some sort of presentation or update on the monitoring enterprise review and to contact a former member who's not here right now, but Vince Resch, to see if that's something he'll be interested in doing. Any edits to the follow-up items?
Okay, thanks, Edmund. Excellent as usual. Final item, is there any public comments for any matters that were not on the agenda?
There are none.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Thanks for your attention and input. I found it really fun to talk about food webs. So thanks everyone. We'll see you in a month and stay healthy. We're officially adjourned.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye.
Bye.